My name is Ella Lake. My pronouns are they, them. I'm a white non-binary teenager with short bleach blonde hair, and I'm wearing a red knitted sweater. My background is just a blank white wall.
Okay. So my name is Bruce Curtis. I imagine my pronouns are he and him, and his. And I am a white male, approximately 71 years old. And I am in a wheelchair. I have a blue shirt on. I'm in my home. And so you can see paintings on the wall and in my living room area.
So, how did you meet Ed Roberts?
So I met Ed Roberts in, I'm going to guess, somewhere around 1975. I was attending a meeting in California of independent living centers, which had recently been set up in California. As it turns out, Ed had been one of the founder and the executive director, I think, of the Center for Independent Living in Berkeley. But when Jerry Brown became governor, he appointed Ed to be the director of the California Department of Vocational Rehabilitation. And so one of the things that Ed did was redirect some of the budget funds of this state agency to help set up centers for independent living in California. And so he put out money for, I'm not sure how many were in that first group. It's been a long time. It might have been seven independent living centers that were set up. Might have been 8 or 9. I'm not sure. I think, but it was about 7 or so. And I was living in the city of Pasadena, and I had read about independent living centers, and I had gone out and created my own independent living center. I founded one in the city of Pasadena, and supported by the general funds from the city of Pasadena. And they gave us an old bank building to work in. And we hired a few people using federal work grants, which paid a stipend, monthly stipend for an individual. So I was able to create an independent living center. It was called the Center for Living Independently in Pasadena. And so I was able to go and attend this meeting that was held, I believe it was held somewhere in the north. I don't remember what city it was. And participate with these other independent living centers that were created. And that was where I first met Ed Roberts.
Do you, like, what was your impression of him? What was his personality like?
I think it's hard to put into a couple of words any individual, including Ed. He was very much a take charge person. He took charge of whatever room he was in, and in any meeting he was in, and so he would speak. Since he was a quadriplegic with post-polio, he didn't have a lot of strength in his breathing, so he would speak at the same time sucking in air from an air tube. But he was very proactive in his words. He was very much trying to make a personal connection with any individual that was in the room. So I saw him as friendly. I saw him as dynamic, and I and he was likable. That's my impressions of him.
So what wisdom did Ed pass on to you? I'm interested specifically in like what your shared wisdom would have been in creating independent living centers.
So this answering the question of what wisdom did he pass on to me is awkward, because I did not have a working relationship with Ed where he was mentoring me, or I'm working side by side with him on a project. My experiences with Ed was always being one of many people in a room listening to Ed, and interacting with him occasionally if I had a question. So I don't have that type of experience with him where he passed on his wisdom to me,
right?
Or he influenced me in terms of how I conducted my life,
right?
Other than he was a disability leader, and one that I was more than happy to follow.
So I guess the next question then makes more sense. And what was Ed's legacy? What was Ed's legacy sort of more broadly? Better question.
Sure. Well, Ed had many interests. I only knew a few of them that I got to experience, because Ed, by the time I experienced him, he was the director of the Vocational Rehabilitation Center. And he was a what do you call it? He reorganized and changed the way the Department of Vocational Rehabilitation in California focused on persons with severe disability, and where they spent their money. Up until Ed got in as director, the Department of Vocational Rehabilitation was focused more on institutions, that for things that used to be in our society, like sheltered workshops. And that was not what Ed was interested in. Ed was interested in integration in the community, and having disabled people be just normal people in the community, living in the community and having a good life. So his changes in the budget and in the policies of the Department of Rehabilitation had a big impact on what was possible for disabled people to do in this state. That I was a client of the Department of Vocational Rehabilitation during this time, and they paid for my college education, and they helped me in dealing with getting a vehicle that I could drive, and I'm a quadriplegic, and so that was a big assistance for me as to be independent in my life. And that came out of what he did with the vocational rehabilitation department. Also, since Ed was interested in changing the community, I began to learn, from the experiences of the Center for Independent Living in Berkeley, what that meant and how to do that on a broader scale. Now, let me explain. I founded and was the director of the Center for Independent Living in Pasadena for 3 years. And then in the 4th year, I left that job and went to Berkeley and worked at the Center for Independent Living in Berkeley for a year. And I was helping to set up independent living centers in other states and developing a national policy on what was a center for independent living, what kind of services does it provide, how do you train a board of directors that includes and is dominated by disabled people, how do you train them? And so I was conducting trainings for the board members of these new centers for independent living. So again, that was my own personal professional development. Came through the Centers for Independent Living, being a part of the founding and the management of them and helping others do it in other cities. That I then, after I did that for a year in Berkeley, I helped set up another independent living center in Houston, Texas, and created one there. And then I decided that I was going to take the lessons that I had learned from the disability movement in the United States, from the center, from our civil and human rights activities, as well as the integration in the community, and I took it international. I started working and figuring out how to transfer the information and the experiences of disability activism into cultures in other countries, and proceeded to make my career doing that, and have been very successful doing that for at least the last 40 years. So cool. His legacy has very much shaped my life, my professional life, my personal life, so I consider it pretty substantial.
Yeah. What do you think Ed's dream for the disability community today would be?
That's an interesting question, because there has been a lot of progress a lot of progress has been made in America. There is still a lot that needs to be done. Because any laws and policies that have been passed always need improvement because there's always somebody who gets missed and is not taken care of or is discriminated against. Continuing to defend the laws and policies that we have is always necessary. Figuring out new things that need to be done is always necessary and good. And so it's I think his feelings of what young people should do today is pretty much what we've been talking about.
Yeah.
Is that they care and that they want to get involved and that they see it's important to themselves and they're not just doing it for other people. I've always done things for myself, and I've also done things for other people.
Yeah. I mean, they're tied, right?
Correct.
Do you have any funny memories or stories of
Yes,
Ed?
I have one very good memory and story of Ed that I don't think you will hear from anyone else.
Awesome.
So I started when as I have been doing my international work. Ed founded after he left the Department of Vocational Rehabilitation. He and Judy founded the World Institute on Disability. And this was meant to be a policy and research center for disabled professionals. So I went to the World Institute on Disability in 1992, after I had already been working in other countries. And I just said I wanted to work in Russia because the Soviet Union had just ceased to exist. And I knew that this was a good opportunity to introduce new laws and policies for persons with disabilities. as they tried to figure out what type of a country they wanted to create. And this was, at the time, Joan Leon was the executive director of the World Institute of Disability, along with Ed and Judy, kind of like a threesome again. That's what they were. And that's what they were in the Center of Independent Living too. And so there was agreement for me to go do this. And so I went to Russia, and I set up and started a program there, a project for strengthening the one of the disability organizations in Russia. It was called the All Russian Society for the Physically Disabled, and I started working with them over several years, and that became a very successful project. One of the things I did in the middle of the 1990s, probably, I'm going to guess, I could be wrong on this, but it was probably somewhere around 1994, 95. And I was working with the leadership of the All Russian Society, and their leaders from all of their regions. They have 80 regions in Russia, and they bring them together once a year for a conference and a training. So I was doing a training for these leaders, and I invited Ed to come, and Ed came to Moscow in order to talk with them as part of our training activity. Well, Ed is a very flamboyant personality, and he's interested in lots of things. And one of the things that Ed was interested in is karate. And if you have a photograph of Ed, have you seen what he looks like? Ed is in a very big power wheelchair that he's kind of laying out in, and with his respirator attached to the back, and he's breathing with a mouth, with his mouth tube occasionally. And so he came over, but he came over with his karate instructor and a couple other people. So Ed has his entourage basically. And I, when he showed up, I thought, oh, he introduced me to his karate teacher, and I was like floored. I was like, okay, why did you bring your karate teacher to Moscow? And that's not even talking about, like, why are you doing karate? He can move his thumb, he basically can move his thumb, so he can control his joystick. And he said, well, I brought my karate teacher so I can give a karate demonstration to all the leaders of in the disability organization. Okay, I said, that'll be interesting. I'm very curious. I'd like to see that. So we created time for him. We were in a very large ballroom, and he came in with his chair and his karate instructor, and they got their karate gear on, and they do a couple of movements together, demonstrating how he was able to do, how he would work with somebody doing karate. Now, I was just floored, looking at this, because I just never thought of karate that way. And this is a good story as an example for how Ed was willing to do almost anything. He was willing to try anything, break new grounds, break new territory for being a person who is severely disabled, and it would not think anything was out of bounds. So I think the Russians were amazed to see this as well. And they didn't start up a disability karate club, but it was pretty fascinating to see him do this karate exhibition in Moscow to these disability leaders. So that's one of my memorable stories of Ed. yeah, to
That,
give a sense of him.
yeah, that certainly makes the cut of memorable.
Is there anything else, Bruce, that you want to like add in that you didn't get to say?
No, because another story I had, I don't think you want to, I don't think you want to broadcast. So
We could.
so,
I kind of want to know it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I was constant. I mean, I was always amazed being around Ed, because he got married. I watched him get married. He had a baby. Shocked me that he had a baby. I was also married and had my own baby by that time, but it shocked me that Ed got married and had a baby, and he was thrilled, with his son growing up. And I got to watch that, for over the years occasionally. And so Ed was always surprising me. There was another time in 1981 when Ed went to Singapore, and I went to Singapore. This was the founding of an international worldwide movement of disabled organizations. And so they were invited from all over the world, and I went there. Ed was there. Judy didn't go to that one, but it was a multi-day conference, and Ed was at that one as well. Ed was always where he needed to be in terms of the movement. He was very active that way. It's anyways, I don't have a lot of stories about Ed. I gave you my best and my biggest one, because that's one nobody else knows about.
Mhm.
So
I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for doing this interview. I feel like I say this every time, but it's been like really an honor for me to get to be on the background of all of these interviews, because nobody else has like listened to all of them yet. And I just like, it has been super fun knowing like Ella and like a bunch of other people. I think like you were talking about the disability community and like kind of younger leaders today. We have a team of like 30 youth, and we're doing these interviews, and it has just been amazing to watch each youth like get all jazzed for these interviews and then get like propelled out to do their own like disability justice work.